He held my hand in front of 400 people, and he never let go. Not even when his family was watching. That single moment should have been a triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of the most terrifying secret of my life. Because 3 days earlier, I had found a letter in his desk that was never meant for me. Written in handwriting I recognized instantly, addressed to a version of myself I didn't know existed yet. I had spent 6 years convinced my best friend was the one person in the world who would never look at me the way I looked at him. I was wrong, and the truth he'd buried for years was about to force us both into a choice that could either save everything we'd built or destroy it in a single afternoon. Graduation was supposed to be an ending. It became a door. But what happened next changed my life forever. Adrian Voss had rehearsed the walk across that stage in his head at least 100 times. But he never once imagined it would end with someone else's fingers laced through his. The sun over Wren Hollow University hung low and gold that afternoon, the kind of light that made even the plainest brick buildings look like something out of memory rather than reality. Rows of graduates in navy gowns rippled like a slow tide across the lawn, and somewhere behind the folding chairs a brass band was tuning up, off-key and hopeful. Adrian stood near the edge of the staging area. 23 years old, 5 years of architecture drafts and sleepless studio nights compressed into one flimsy diploma folder, and he felt, as he always did in crowds, like a man standing slightly outside his own body. He found Elias Marlowe the way he always found him, not by looking, but by some old instinct that had never failed since they were 14. Elias was leaning against a maple tree at the edge of the ceremony, out of uniform in every sense, still in his paramedic blues because his shift had run long. His gown draped over one arm like an afterthought. He hadn't even graduated that day. He'd finished his EMT certification 2 years earlier and had simply come to watch, the way he always came to watch the important things in Adrian's life, standing just far enough back that no one would ask questions, and close enough that Adrian never once had to face anything alone. Their story didn't start with romance. It started with silence. When Adrian was 16, his father died in a car accident on a rain-slicked overpass, and for 3 weeks afterward Adrian didn't speak a single unnecessary word to anyone. Elias, who had only been his neighbor for a year at that point, started showing up anyway. He'd sit on the porch steps without saying anything, sometimes for an hour, just so Adrian wouldn't have to be alone with the sound of his own house being quiet. Nobody had ever done that for him before. Nobody had ever done it since. It was the kind of thing that didn't need romance to become the most important relationship of a person's life. Simply was. But somewhere in the last 2 years, something in Adrian had shifted quietly and without permission, the way rust spreads on the underside of a beam you never inspect until it's already through the metal. He noticed the way Elias's forearms flexed when he lifted a patient onto a gurney during ride-along days. He noticed the low, steady voice Elias used on emergency calls, the one that made grown men trust him instantly. He noticed, with a kind of private shame, that when Elias laughed at something stupid Adrian said, the sound rearranged something in his chest that had nothing to do with friendship. He told no one, least of all Elias, who, as far as Adrian understood the world, had never once shown interest in men, who spoke sometimes of a future with a family and a porch and Sunday dinners in a tone that always sounded borrowed from somebody else's script. The ceremony crawled forward, name after name, and when Adrian's turn finally came, he crossed the stage on legs that felt disconnected from his body, shook the dean's hand, and turned to find the crowd. That was when he saw Elias moving, not sitting, walking directly toward the rope line separating graduates from guests, ignoring the usher who tried to wave him back. Adrian's first instinct was panic. Some emergency, someone hurt, until he saw Elias's face, and it wasn't the face of a man responding to a crisis. It was the face of a man who had run out of ways to wait. Elias reached through the rope line, took Adrian's hand in front of the entire graduating class, in front of Elias's own father seated 3 rows back in a gray suit, and simply held it. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't kiss him. He just held on, thumb pressed once, hard, against Adrian's knuckles, like a man trying to communicate something too large for language. Adrian's ears rang. Somewhere a camera flashed, and for exactly 4 seconds, the entire world narrowed down to the warmth of one hand refusing to let go of his. Then Elias released him, smiled like nothing unusual had happened, and said, "Congratulations, Voss. You did it," in the same easy tone he'd used 1,000 times before, and walked back to his spot at the tree line as if he hadn't just detonated something inside Adrian's chest that would take weeks to stop ringing. For 3 days, Adrian told himself it meant nothing. Elias was affectionate. Elias hugged his male friends, ruffled hair, threw arms over shoulders without a second thought. The kind of easy physical warmth some men carried without ever examining it. Adrian had built an entire defense of denial brick by brick, and it might have held, if not for the letter. It happened by accident, the way most devastating discoveries do. Adrian had gone to Elias's apartment to return a borrowed drafting lamp, and Elias had stepped out to take a call from dispatch. Waiting, Adrian set the lamp down on the desk and in doing so knocked loose a slim wooden drawer that wasn't quite latched. A folded paper slid halfway out. He almost ignored it. He didn't. The handwriting was Elias's. Blocky, slightly slanted. The handwriting of a man who wrote fast because his mind moved faster than his hand. It was dated 2 years earlier and it began, "I don't know why I'm writing this instead of saying it, except that I've never once in my life said the true thing out loud when it mattered." Adrian's stomach dropped through the floor. He kept reading, though every instinct told him to stop, to fold the paper back exactly as he'd found it and pretend the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. The letter never mentioned Adrian by name. It didn't have to. It described a person who held silence like it was sacred, who had a way of tilting his head when he was drawing that made the whole room go quiet, who the writer loved in a way that terrified him because it broke every promise he'd ever made to himself, to his father, to the version of his own life he'd been told to want. The last line was the one that stopped Adrian's breath entirely. "If I ever tell him, it has to be after graduation. He deserves to walk across that stage without carrying the weight of what I am." Adrian folded the letter and put it back exactly where he'd found it, hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries. When Elias came back inside, phone still in hand, Adrian said nothing. He smiled, made a joke about the lamp, and left 10 minutes later with his entire understanding of the last 6 years quietly rewritten. He didn't sleep that night or the next. He turned the words over and over, searching for an explanation that didn't mean what he was terrified it meant, and finding none. On the 3rd night, unable to bear the not knowing any longer, he drove to Elias's apartment at 11 at night, stood at the door for 4 full minutes without knocking, and finally knocked anyway. Elias opened the door in gray sweatpants and an old Fire Academy shirt, hair damp from a shower, and the moment he saw Adrian's face, something in his own expression collapsed slightly, like a man watching a diagnosis arrive before the doctor even opens their mouth. "You found it," Elias said. Not a question. "I wasn't looking," Adrian said. "The drawer wasn't shut. I saw the date. I read 3 lines before I understood what it was. And then I couldn't stop." Elias didn't deny it, didn't reach for an excuse. He stepped back from the doorway, silently inviting Adrian in, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The apartment smelled like rain and old coffee. Somewhere down the hall a pipe knocked twice and went quiet. "Say something," Adrian finally whispered. "Please. Anything. I've loved you since we were 19, Elias said, and his voice, usually so steady on emergency calls, cracked cleanly down the middle. "Maybe before that. I don't actually know when it started because it didn't feel like something that started. It felt like something I woke up already inside of one day and never found the door out of." "Then why?" Adrian's voice broke too. 6 years, Elias. 6 years of watching you talk about some imaginary future with a wife and a porch and kids. And I told myself I was insane for feeling anything because you were straight, because you'd never once. "I'm not straight," Elias said quietly. "I never was. I just decided a long time ago that it didn't matter what I was, because there was no version of my life where I got to have both things I wanted, you and my father's face still looking at me the way it does now." The mention of his father detonated something colder in the room. Adrian had met Warren Marlowe exactly enough times to understand the shape of the man without ever fully seeing inside him. A retired battalion fire chief, decorated twice, a man who spoke about honor and duty the way other men spoke about weather, casual and constant. He had also, once, at a family barbecue 3 years earlier, made an offhand comment about a cousin who'd come out at 20, A comment delivered so quietly and so certainly that the whole table had gone silent, and Elias, 18 at the time, had gone paler than Adrian had ever seen him. He said the word disappointment. Elias said now, staring at a spot on the floor like the memory was still sitting there. Not about me. About someone else's son. But I understood exactly what he meant, and exactly what would happen if it were ever about his own. He looked up, eyes wet in a way Adrian had genuinely never witnessed before. Not once, not even at funerals. My mother died when I was 9, Adrian. My father is the only family I have left in this world who still shows up. I have spent my whole life terrified that if he ever saw the real shape of me, I would lose the last person standing between me and being completely alone. So I built a version of myself that could keep both things, could keep you close and keep him proud, and I told myself that silence was a fair price to pay for not losing either one. And the handhold, Adrian said, his throat raw. At graduation. In front of him. Why now? Elias exhaled something that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. Because your father used to say something to me. Before he died. I never told you this because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was using his memory as an excuse. 3 weeks before the accident, he pulled me aside on your porch. You were inside doing something, I don't even remember what, and he said, whatever you're carrying that you think you have to carry alone, don't. Not around my son. He doesn't need protecting from the truth. He needs someone who'll actually stay. I didn't understand it then. I think I understand it now. I think he saw something in both of us before either of us saw it in ourselves. Adrian sat down slowly on the edge of the worn couch, the weight of 6 years reorganizing itself in his chest all at once. Grief for his father folding into this new, raw thing, the two griefs somehow the same shape. He never told me that, he said. He wouldn't have, Elias said. It wasn't a message for you. It was permission for me. I think he knew I'd need it eventually, even if it took me 6 more years to actually use it. The confession should have been the climax of the story. It wasn't. It was only the opening of the real one. 3 weeks after graduation, Adrian received an email that should have been the single greatest moment of his professional life. An acceptance letter into the Hallbrook Design Fellowship, a 2-year architectural residency in Copenhagen so competitive that fewer than a dozen graduates worldwide were selected each cycle. It was the exact dream he had built his entire adult life toward. Ever since he was 17 and had sketched his first building on the back of his father's funeral program because he hadn't known what else to do with his hands. It represented everything. Legacy, purpose, proof that grief could be built into something that stood upright and mattered. It also meant leaving in 6 weeks, for 2 years, an ocean away from the one person who had finally, terrifyingly, become something more than a friend. He didn't tell Elias for 4 days. When he finally did, sitting across from him at the same small kitchen table where their whole relationship had quietly reorganized itself weeks earlier, Elias's reaction wasn't jealousy, wasn't fear disguised as anger. It was something worse. It was immediate, complete happiness, unclouded by a single trace of self-interest. Adrian, this is everything you've wanted since you were a kid, Elias said, gripping his hand across the table hard enough to hurt. This isn't a decision. This is the reason you exist. Don't, Adrian said. Don't do the thing where you make this easy for me by pretending it doesn't cost you anything. Costs me everything, Elias admitted, quiet and immediate. But I've spent my whole life shrinking things down so they'd fit inside a life my father could approve of. I am not going to do that to you. I refuse to be the reason you build a smaller life than the one you were meant to have. It would have been simple, in a lesser story, for Elias to ask Adrian to stay, or for Adrian to quietly resent him for not asking. Instead, the days that followed became a slow, aching negotiation between two people who loved each other too honestly to let love become a cage. They talked about distance, about video calls across a 6-hour difference, about the brutal arithmetic of a relationship attempted across an ocean while one man ran emergency calls at 3 a.m. and the other sat in a Copenhagen studio surrounded by strangers. Neither of them pretended it would be easy. Both of them, separately, in the privacy of their own fear, began quietly wondering if the honest answer was that this thing between them, barely 3 weeks old, might not survive what was coming. The unexpected turn arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, in the ugliest possible way. Elias collapsed during a routine training shift, dropping mid-stride during a physical certification run, and was rushed by his own colleagues to the same hospital where he'd spent 6 years pulling other people out of ambulances. Adrian got the call from a nurse instead of from Elias himself, which was, in itself, the most frightening detail of all. The diagnosis, once it came, was a congenital heart arrhythmia, one that had likely been present since childhood, silent and unnoticed, the exact kind of hidden defect Elias had spent his career searching for in other people's bodies while never once suspecting it lived in his own. It wasn't fatal if managed. It was, however, permanently incompatible with continued field work as a paramedic, a career built entirely on physical extremity and adrenaline. In one afternoon, Elias lost the only professional identity he'd ever built for himself. The same week Adrian was preparing to lose him to an ocean. Adrian arrived at the hospital still in his work clothes, breathless, and found Elias sitting upright in a hospital bed with the specific blankness of a man whose entire understood future had just been rewritten by a piece of paper. "Say something," Adrian said, echoing, without meaning to, the exact words Elias had said to him weeks earlier. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the person who runs toward the emergency," Elias said quietly. "That's not a metaphor. That's the actual truth. I built my whole life around being the person who shows up when everyone else is running away. I don't know what's left of me without that." It was Adrian's turn, finally, after years of being the one who was carried, to do the carrying. He didn't offer empty comfort. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed, took Elias's hand, the same hand that had once refused to let go of his in front of 400 strangers, and said, "You've spent your whole life running toward burning buildings that weren't yours to save, partly because it let you avoid ever sitting still long enough to ask what you actually wanted for yourself. Maybe this isn't the end of who you are. Maybe it's the first time in your life you get to actually choose it instead of inheriting it." It was Elias who said it first 3 days later, sitting on the same porch steps where their entire story had begun 9 years earlier. "I want to build something," he said, "not save people after the fire starts. Build the thing that keeps kids like us from ever needing saving in the first place. A shelter, a real one, for kids aging out of the system, kids whose families disowned them the second they found out who they were. I've been carrying the idea for years and never let myself actually want it, because wanting things always felt like a door my father could slam shut." Adrian went very still. "That's a building," he said slowly. "That's an actual building, Elias. Foundations, structure, a floor plan for a life nobody else was going to design for them." They looked at each other for a long moment, and something clicked into place between them with the quiet, undeniable finality of a keystone dropping into an arch. The twist that reorganized everything wasn't a secret enemy or a hidden rival. It was simpler and far more human. Two men who had spent years assuming love meant choosing between each other and everything else they wanted, discovering instead that the life they actually wanted had been designed, unknowingly, to fit together the entire time. Adrian didn't abandon Copenhagen. He deferred it 1 year, a negotiation the fellowship board approved with unusual grace once he submitted, unprompted, an early concept sketch of a residential shelter built around light, safety, and dignity, the exact kind of humane, purposeful design work the fellowship claimed to exist for in the first place. Elias, for the first time in 9 years, began speaking to his father not as a boy protecting a secret, but as a man stating a fact. The conversation with Warren Marlowe happened on a Sunday evening in early autumn, at the same kitchen table where Elias had once eaten dinner in careful, practiced silence for 2 decades. Elias didn't dress it up in metaphor. He simply said, "Dad, I love him. I have for years. I'm done pretending otherwise, and I need to know whether that's something you can live with, because I can't keep shrinking myself down to fit a shape you're comfortable with."